The locksmith's drill was already screaming through the deadbolt when Adeline Rourke came around the corner with her son's lunchbox still in her hand. 7 weeks a widow, 16 years in that house. Her mother-in-law stood on the porch with a folder of papers and did not look up. Nobody shouted. Nobody had to. By noon, Adeline owned 2 suitcases, a 9-year-old boy, and a note in her dead grandmother's handwriting that made no sense at all. If you're with me, hit subscribe and stay to the end and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments so I can see how far this story travels tonight. The drill stopped, and in the silence that followed, Adeline understood that the sound had been the last thing she would ever hear from that house. She had walked back for a lunchbox. That was the whole reason she was standing there. Toby had left it on the counter beside the sink, the blue one with the dent in the lid, and she had driven 11 minutes back across town telling herself she'd be in and out before the school bell. She had her keys in her fist. She had already been reaching for the door. Vivian Rourke turned a page in her folder. She was 71 years old, and she had the hands of a woman who had never once in her life been in a hurry. "The trust holds the deed, Adeline," she said. "It always did. Reed never changed it, and I'm not going to pretend today that he meant to." There was no cruelty in it. That was the part Adeline would turn over in her mind for months afterward, in parking lots, in gas station bathrooms, in the front seat of a Bronco at 4 in the morning. Cruelty she could have fought. Cruelty gave you something to push against. What Vivian handed her instead was procedure, soft-voiced, well-lit, already finished before Adeline had been told it was beginning. She had buried her husband 49 days earlier. She had stood at the graveside holding her son's hand so hard the boy's fingers had gone white, and she hadn't noticed until he pulled away. In those 49 days, she had answered 112 condolence messages, canceled a phone line, learned that grief has a filing system, and let herself believe foolishly she saw now that the worst had already happened. The locksmith wouldn't meet her eyes. He packed his case and left the new keys on the porch rail in a small paper envelope, and Vivian picked them up and put them in her purse, and that gesture was the closest thing to violence that occurred all morning. "You have 72 hours for your personal effects," Vivian said. "I'd rather it not become unpleasant." Adeline heard herself say unpleasant. "There's no need to repeat me." She did not scream. She thought about it. She stood on the walk with her son's lunchbox in her hand, and she felt the scream sitting in her chest like a stone. She could not lift, and then she turned around and went to her car and sat in it and did not start the engine for 6 full minutes. That was the first thing she lost. It went fast after that. The 72 hours were the strangest of her life because they were so ordinary. She was allowed inside. Vivian gave her a key, a temporary one, on a little ring which Adeline had to return, and Adeline walked through her own house deciding what she was permitted to grieve. The furniture belonged to the trust. The appliances belonged to the trust. The good dishes had come from Vivian's mother. The dining table where Toby had done his homework every night since he was 4 had come down through the Rourkes and had a burn mark from a hot pan that Adeline herself had put there, and it stayed. She took clothes. She took Toby's books and his blanket and the shoebox of Reed's letters from before they were married. She took a coffee tin of buttons that had belonged to her own grandmother, and she couldn't have said why. She took photographs out of frames and left the frames. She did not take the good coat. She thought about that afterward, too. There was a wool coat in the hall closet, the only expensive thing she'd ever owned, a gift from Reed the winter Toby was born, and she stood in front of it for a long moment and decided it was too much to carry. 3 weeks later, in a laundromat parking lot in 28 degrees, she would remember that coat with a bitterness that shocked her. Toby helped. He was 9 and he thought it was a project. He wrapped every one of his dinosaurs in a sock individually, and it took him 90 minutes, and Adeline let him do it because it was the only 90 minutes in 3 days that either of them was happy. On the last night, they slept on the floor of his room because the beds were gone. In the dark, he said, "Are we coming back after?" She had prepared for that question for 3 days, and she still had nothing. "Not to this house," she said. "Okay." A long pause. "But we're coming back to something." "Yes," she said. "Yes, we're coming back to something." She had no idea whether that was a promise or a lie, and she made it anyway, and she thought that was probably what most mothers were doing at 11 o'clock at night all over the world. The Bronco was silver and 11 years old, and it had a heater that worked if you hit the dash. It became for 19 days their home. She had done the arithmetic. She was a bookkeeper by trade. She had done other people's arithmetic for 14 years. And the arithmetic said an apartment required first month, last month, and deposit, and that was $2,700. She did not have, and the funeral had eaten the savings, and Reed's employer had a life insurance policy that was in dispute because he had died 6 days after switching plans. 6 days. She would think about that number too. She parked behind a laundromat on Ridge Street because the owner left the lot lights on all night and because there was a bathroom that opened at 5:30 in the morning. She got Toby to school every single day. She wanted that on the record somewhere, even if the only record was her own memory. 19 days, 0 absences, hair-combed shirt, buttoned homework done on the tailgate under a work light. She told him it was an adventure. He believed her for about 6 days. On the 7th, he said from the back seat without any particular emotion, "This isn't a vacation, is it?" "Nobody." "Okay." He looked out the window. "Can we still call it one at school?" That was the moment she nearly broke. Not the locksmith, not Vivian. Her 9-year-old son negotiating the terms of his own dignity from the back seat of a Bronco. "We can call it whatever you want," she said. She applied for 11 jobs. She got 2 interviews. At the second one, a regional accounting office with good light and a receptionist who offered her coffee. The woman across the desk looked at her application and said kindly that they'd need a current address for payroll and would she mind updating it. And Adeline said she was between residences at the moment and she watched the interview end while it was still happening. That night, she took her wedding ring off in the parking lot and held it under the dome light for a long time. She knew what a pawn shop would give her for it. She had already looked it up on her phone, sitting in that same seat, which she considered the most shameful thing she had ever done and also the most practical. She put it back on, not out of sentiment, out of stubbornness. She decided she would sell the ring on the day she had absolutely nothing else left, and she would know that day when it came, and it hadn't come yet, and that distinction was the only thing she still owned outright. The call came on a Tuesday at 2:40 in the afternoon while she was sitting in the Bronco outside Toby's school with the engine off to save gas. The number was an area code she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She'd stopped answering unknown numbers weeks ago because they were always collections. "Mrs. Rourke, my name is Halbert Voss. I'm an attorney in Cutter County, North Carolina. I'm the executor for the estate of Ruth Halloway." Adeline's grandmother had died in March. Adeline had not gone to the funeral. She had been 13 days into planning her husband's. "I know who she is," Adeline said. Was. "Yes, ma'am. I apologize for the delay in reaching you. We had an old address." A shuffle of paper and the man's voice went into a flatter register, the reading voice. "Mrs. Halloway left you real property, 11 acres and change in Hollis Bend, including a farmhouse, an orchard, and outbuildings. There's no mortgage on it. There's no lie-in on it. It's clear." Adeline sat very still. "Mrs. Rourke, how much is it worth?" She heard how it sounded coming out of her mouth. She did not take it back. The lawyer didn't seem surprised. "Assessed at $192,000. It'd sell for more. There's a developer's been sniffing at that whole ridge for 6 or 7 years now." $192,000. She looked through the windshield at the doors of the elementary school, where in 11 minutes her son was going to come running out with his backpack half open, and she did the arithmetic before the lawyer had finished his sentence. $2,700 for the apartment, $9,400 in medical debt, $4,100 in funeral debt, a used car that wouldn't die in a year, a deposit, a bed for Toby with a frame and a room with a door. "Mrs. Rourke, there's one more thing. I'm here. Your grandmother left instructions with the file. Not in the will proper, it's a separate envelope sealed addressed to you in her hand. I'm supposed to give it to you in person on the property. She was specific about that. Can you just read it to me?" "I could," he said slowly. "I'd rather not. Mrs. Halloway was particular. She had me put it in the file myself and she watched me do it." Adeline closed her eyes. "I'll be there Friday," she said. She had not seen Ruth Halloway in 19 years. That was a fact she carried the whole 8-hour drive, and it got heavier the closer she got. There had been a falling out not between Adeline and Ruth, but between Ruth and Adeline's mother over something so old and so thoroughly relitigated that Adeline had never been given a clean version of it. Her mother's version involved the word stubborn. Her mother's version involved Ruth refusing to sell that land in the 80s when the family needed money and refusing again in the 90s, and refusing a third time when Adeline's grandfather Wendell got sick and the bills came. She'd rather sit on 11 acres of weeds than help her own family. Adeline had heard that at least 40 times growing up. Adeline had written to her grandmother twice as an adult, once when she got married, once when Toby was born. Both times Ruth had written back on plain paper in a hand that leaned hard to the right, and both letters had been warm and short, and had ended the same way: when you have time, come see the orchard. Adeline had never had time. She saw that now for what it was, which was not a schedule problem. She drove down on a Friday with Toby asleep against the window and a napkin in her purse, with the debt figures on it, and she had a plan, and the plan was simple. Sign the papers. Call a realtor. List it Monday. Be back in Ohio inside 2 weeks with a check and a life. She said it out loud somewhere around Knoxville to nobody. I'm not staying, I'm just selling it. Again, Halbert Voss was 70 if he was a day, and he met them in the driveway with his hat in his hand. The house was smaller than she had expected and better kept than it had any right to be. Somebody had been mowing. That was the first thing that struck her as strange, though she filed it under nice neighbors and forgot it for 4 days. Voss walked her through the house. He gave her the keys, the tax card, a folder. Toby ran ahead of them from room to room in a way that made Adeline's chest hurt, because it had been 22 days since her son had been able to run from room to room in anything. At the kitchen table, Voss set the envelope down and slid it across. It had her name on it, Adeline, just that, in that hard, right-leaning hand. She opened it with her thumb. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and on it one line: before you sell this land, open the old shed. She turned it over. Nothing on the back. She looked in the envelope. Nothing else. That's it, she said. That's it. Mr. Voss, she put the paper flat on the table. I drove 8 hours. I know it. 8 hours for one sentence. Voss put his hat on his knee. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice had changed slightly, less lawyer in it. Mrs. Rourke, I did your grandmother's business for 31 years. She was the most deliberate person I ever met in my life. She never once said a thing she hadn't already thought about for a week. He tapped the table twice with one finger. If she used one sentence, it's because she only needed one. He left. Adeline sat at the table with the paper in front of her, and she realized, furious. She had come here with a number in her head, 192,000. She had held on to it for 6 days like a rope. And the woman who had refused to sell this land for 40 years had reached up out of the ground and put a condition on it, and the condition was a shed. Mom, Toby was in the doorway. There's a whole other building out there. She didn't go that night. She wanted to make that clear to herself. She was not going to be summoned. She made grilled cheese on a stove that lit on the third try. She found bedding in a hall closet that smelled like cedar and had been folded in a way that no one folds bedding they intend to use. She put Toby in the back bedroom in an actual bed, and he was asleep in under 4 minutes, and she stood in the doorway watching him breathe for longer than she'd admit. Then she sat on the porch steps in the dark with the note in her hand and did what she'd been doing every night for a month, which was math. Realtor commission at 6%, closing costs, estate transfer, capital gains. Maybe she'd need to check. Call it 160 net if the developer was real. $160,000 was not a fortune. It was precisely a floor. It was the difference between a woman who could not pass a payroll address check and a woman who could. And her grandmother wanted her to open a shed. She went inside at 11 and lay on top of the covers in the front bedroom, in the house of a woman she had let become a stranger, and she did not sleep well. And at 6:15 in the morning, she got up and made coffee and did not go to the shed. She went at 9:40 with Toby, because he asked 11 times. The building stood at the far edge of the orchard, past the last row of trees, and it was small, maybe 14 by 20. The red paint had mostly surrendered. One shutter hung wrong. The roof had a dip in it near the back, but the grass around it was cut close and recently in a neat ring, maybe 6 feet out from the walls, and Adeline noticed that, and her stomach did something she didn't have a word for. Somebody's been mowing, she said. Neighbors probably, Toby said in the voice of a 9-year-old repeating something he'd heard an adult say 12 hours earlier. There was no padlock. She had assumed there would be a padlock. She had assumed the whole thing would end with her calling a locksmith, and there was a nasty little irony waiting in that, and she never got to use it. The door was held by an iron latch, hand-forged black with age, and it lifted under her thumb without resistance. "Grandma said this one first," Toby said. Adeline pulled the door open. She had expected rot. She had built an entire expectation over 8 hours of driving, mouse nests, a rusted mower, a wall of cardboard boxes gone soft at the bottom, 40 years of a dead woman's junk that Adeline would have to pay somebody $400 to haul off before she could list the property. The room was clean. Not clean the way a room is clean after somebody tidies it. Clean the way a room is clean because someone has been keeping it. The floor had been swept. There was no dust on the horizontal surfaces. Not none, but not 40 years worth. Not 5 months worth. Not the gray felt that settles over things nobody visits. Tools hung on the wall in order of size. A coil of rope was coiled properly. A rocking chair sat near the window with a quilt folded over the back of it, folded in thirds square at the corners. Adeline stood in the doorway and did not go in. "It's like a room," Toby said. "Yeah. Not like a shed, like a room somebody lives in." "Yeah," Adeline said, "it is. Her grandmother had died in March. It was the second week of November. Somebody had swept this floor since March." She went in slowly and she found herself doing something ridiculous, which was walking quietly, like a woman entering a church late. There was a workbench along the right wall and it had been cleared. Not clean cleared, deliberately the way you clear a surface when you're setting something out for someone. On it sat 4 objects, and they had been arranged with space between them. A brass lantern polished. A pair of reading glasses folded. A pocket watch on a chain, the case worn smooth at one corner by a thumb. And an envelope. The envelope was face up. Across the front in the same hard right-leaning hand 3 words. "For my family." Adeline's hands were not steady. She noticed that as an outside observer might, and she thought, "This is a shed. This is a shed and I am shaking." She opened it. "If you're reading this, then you honored my only request and I thank you for it. What's in this room isn't valuable for what it would bring. It's valuable because it's true, and true things have been in short supply on this land for a long while. Don't rush. Some stories can only be taken 1 page at a time, and I have never once seen a person do the right thing in a hurry." She read it 3 times. Then she set it down and said quietly to nobody, "Grandma, what did you do?" Behind. It was Toby who found the chest. He'd gone toward the back corner where a white cloth covered something waist high, and he lifted the corner of it and he said, "Mom," in a voice that had gone up half an octave. It was cedar, 4 feet long, banded in brass gone dark with a hasp, and unlike the door of the shed, unlike anything else in the room, the chest was locked. The key was sitting on the lid. Adeline picked it up and it was warm. She knew exactly why it was warm. It had been sitting in a bar of sunlight from the window since 8 in the morning, and knowing why did not help at all. It sat in her palm like something with a pulse. She did not open it right away. She would never be able to explain that afterward to anyone. She sat down on the floor beside the chest with the key in her hand, and she stayed there for a minute and a half doing nothing. And the wind moved in the orchard outside, and Toby, to his eternal credit, sat down next to her and didn't say a word. Then she put the key in the lock and turned it. Inside, everything had been packed the way you pack things you expect someone else to find. Letters in bundles tied with string, and the bundles were dated. Journals, she counted 3 leather worn at the spines. Photographs in envelopes, and the envelopes had years on them. Pressed flowers between wax paper. A child's drawing folded in quarters. A ledger book, the old kind with a marbled cover. And on top of all of it, face up alone, was a photograph. Black and white. 3 people standing under apple trees. The woman on the left was her grandmother. Adeline knew that face instantly. Even young Ruth, at maybe 28, laughing with her whole head thrown back, an expression Adeline had never once seen on her mother's face and had certainly never seen on her own. The man on the right was her grandfather. Wendell Holloway, with his arm around Ruth's shoulders in a work shirt, squinting. And between them in the middle was a man Adeline had never seen in her life. He was maybe 30, tall, a black man in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled, caught mid-laugh, not smiling for a camera, laughing at something the person behind the lens had just said, one hand half raised, as if he'd been about to wave it off. He was in the center of the photograph, not at the edge, not standing apart. The center. Adeline stared at it for a long time. "Who's that?" Toby said. "I don't know." And that was the sentence that broke something open in her, because Adeline Rourke was 36 years old, and she came from a family of talkers. She knew the name of her grandfather's fishing partner. She knew the name of the dog her mother had at 11. She knew from 100 repetitions exactly who had said what at a wedding in 1979 and who had never been forgiven for it. And there was a man in a photograph in the middle of her family laughing in a place of honor, and no one had ever said his name in front of her. Not once, not in 36 years. She turned the photograph over, one line in fading blue ink in a hand that was not her grandmother's. Some families are made by blood, some are made by nerve. She read it out loud. Toby asked what it meant. She said she didn't know, and that was true. And she also knew the way, weather that she was about to find out, and that she was not going to like all of it. She went into the chest properly then. She was not gentle anymore. The first bundle of letters was dated 1968 to 1970. She untied it, and the top letter was in her grandmother's hand, and it began, "Dear Isaiah." She sat back on her heels. The man had a name. She went through 6 more envelopes fast, and the photographs came out in handfuls, and he was in almost all of them. Isaiah at the well pump. Isaiah on a ladder in the orchard with Wendell steadying it. Isaiah at a table indoors with a napkin in his collar and 11 other people around him at what was clearly Christmas. Isaiah holding an infant against his shoulder with one enormous hand splayed across the baby's back. And Adeline knew that baby's blanket because it was in a box in the Bronco. Right now, it was her mother. Her mother, held as a newborn by a man whose name had never been spoken. "Mom, you're going fast," Toby said. "I know." Grandma's letter said don't rush. Adeline stopped. Her hands were full of photographs. She looked at her son who was 9, quoting a dead woman at her, and she almost laughed and almost cried and did neither. "You're right," she said. "You're right, okay." She put them down. She made herself put them down. And that was when she saw the ledger. It was the marbled book at the bottom, and she'd taken it for an account book of the farm, which is exactly what it was. And she opened it the way she'd opened 10,000 ledgers in 14 years of being paid to look at other people's numbers. It was a tax record. Somebody had kept in one book every property tax receipt on the parcel from 1969 forward. Not the papers themselves, those were in an envelope, clipped inside the back, covered decades of them, thin and yellow. The book was the log, date paid, amount, method. 53 years of a woman's careful handwriting in 3 different pens. And then from 1994 onward, in a different hand entirely. And Adeline flipped back and forth twice before she understood that Ruth had simply gotten older and the writing had changed. Adeline ran her finger down the column the way she did at work, not reading, just scanning for the thing that doesn't fit. And she found it in under 30 seconds, because that is what 14 years does to a person. Every entry had a payer. And every entry going back to 1969, in every hand and every pen, said the same thing. Not Holloway. She stopped. She went back to the first page. 1969. Amount $41.16. Paid in full. Payer Bell. 1970. Bell. 1971. Bell. 1975. Bell. 1988. Bell. 2001. Bell. 2019. Bell. 53 consecutive years of property tax on her grandmother's land, paid by somebody named Bell. Adeline's grandmother had died in March. The 2025 entry was there, paid in September, 6 months after Ruth Holloway went into the ground. Bell. She sat down on the floor of the shed. She had to. Her legs made the decision before she did. Mom, giving me a second, bud. She was a bookkeeper. She wanted that understood in her own head right then because it mattered. She was not a woman who got carried away by a photograph. She was a woman who reconciled accounts. And what she was looking at was not a mystery. It was a discrepancy, and discrepancies had causes, and the cause was always one of 3 things: an error, a habit, or a lie. 53 years was not an error. She thought about the mowed grass in a neat ring around the shed. She thought about a swept floor in November on a property whose owner had died in March. She thought about a woman who had refused to sell this land in the 80s when her husband was dying and the bills were coming and her own daughter begged her to. She'd rather sit on 11 acres of weeds. Adeline had heard that her whole life. She had never once, not one single time, asked why. She got up and put the ledger under her arm and said, "We're going back to the house." And her voice came out wrong, and Toby didn't argue. They walked back through the orchard, and there was a truck in the driveway. It was gone by the time they reached the house. She heard it pull out. She didn't see it, and she stood in the drive, listening to it, go down the county road, and then she went to the mailbox because the flag was down, and she had not checked it since arriving. There were 4 things in it: a utility notice, a church bulletin, a grocery circular, and a business envelope, heavy stock, no stamp, hand delivered. She opened it, standing in the road. It was a purchase offer, 2 pages professionally prepared for the entirety of Parcel 44, 1 and 18, Hollis Bend Township, Cutter County, 11 acres and change farmhouse, orchard outbuildings for $231,000, 30-day close, $231,000. $39,000 more than the assessment. Cash. 30 days. No inspection, no financing contingency. There was a line for the seller's signature and a line for a witness and a stamped addressed return envelope, paper-clipped to the back. And there was one further clause on page 2 in the same plain type as everything else. And it read, seller to remove or demolish all outbuildings prior to closing. Buyer will accept no structures on the parcel. Adeline read that clause 4 times. Then she looked at the top of page 1, where the offer was dated, and the whole road went quiet in her ears. The offer was dated the 9th of March. Her grandmother had died on the 12th. Somebody had put an offer on this land 3 days before Ruth Holloway died, and there was no signature anywhere on it. Not a name, not a company, not an agent's line, just a return address that was a post office box in a town Adeline had never heard of, and a demand in writing from a buyer with no name that the shed come down before the money changed hands. Toby tugged her sleeve. Mom, what is it? She folded the pages in half and put them in her back pocket, and she found that she was not shaking anymore. Something in her had gone very cold and very still, and she recognized the feeling from a long way off, because it was the same feeling she'd had standing on the walk with a lunchbox in her hand while a man drilled out her deadbolt. Somebody wants that building gone, she said. She didn't sleep that night either, and by 2 in the morning, she'd stopped pretending she was going to. She sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open and a legal pad beside it, and she worked the way she worked at a job, column by column, no skipping, writing down every anomaly, whether or not it seemed to matter. That was the discipline. 14 years of it. You don't decide what's relevant while you're still counting. By 4, she had 3 pages of notes and one conclusion she didn't like. Somebody named Bell had paid the property tax on this land for 53 consecutive years, including the year after the owner died, and Ruth Holloway had recorded every payment in her own hand with the payer's name attached. That wasn't a favor. Nobody logs a favor for 5 decades. You log a payment when you're keeping account of what's owed. And somebody had offered $231,000 for the parcel 3 days before Ruth died on the condition that the shed be knocked flat first. Adeline underlined that clause twice. Then she wrote a single question beneath it and stared at it until the sky started going gray behind the orchard. Who knew she was dying? She went back out at 7:15 with coffee and a flashlight she didn't need, and she started on the letters properly in order the way Ruth had asked. October 1968, Dear Isaiah, her grandmother's hand but younger, rounder, less severe, the letters not yet leaning so hard. The first ones were nothing. Weather, a hen that had stopped laying, Wendell's back, a recipe for green tomato relish that ran 2 full pages and made Adeline snort out loud at 6 words of it. But by the 4th letter, something had changed in the tone, and Adeline had to read the line twice before she caught what it was. Wendell says the well came in at 40 feet, and the man wants $90 for it. I told him we don't have $90. He said we have 45, and you have 45, and that's how it's going to be, and I said that's how it's going to be then. You and Wendell, split down the middle, not a hired man's arrangement. She went faster. The fence line split, the sprayer split, the seed order in 69 split, and then in the 8th letter a sentence that she read out loud into the empty room because she needed to hear it. I don't like the word tenant, and neither does he, so we've agreed nobody in this house uses it. Adeline set the letter down. Toby came in around 8:30 in his socks with a bowl of cereal, sat on the floor and started sorting photographs into piles by whether Isaiah was in them, which was not a system anybody had asked for, but turned out to be exactly right. By 9, the yes pile was 4 times the size of the no pile. Mom, he's in the Christmas ones, Toby said. I saw. He's in the one with the cake. I saw that too. So why doesn't anybody, he stopped himself. He was 9 and he was working out that some questions land differently when you say them all the way through. Ask it, Adeline said. Now, why doesn't anybody in our family know him? That, she said, is the exact question. Della Whitcomb came up the drive at 11 with a pie, and Adeline's first reaction was the ordinary one, a neighbor, a kindness, the small-town thing people did. She put on coffee and got out 2 of Ruth's cups and made pleasant noise about the drive down from Ohio. Della was in her 80s, sharp-eyed, small, and she sat with her back very straight and her hands around the cup, and she did not once look at Adeline while she talked. She looked at the window, out toward the orchard. She talked for 11 minutes about Ruth, the church, the pie sales, the winter of the ice storm. She was good at it. It had the quality of a story a person has told before. Then she stopped mid-sentence and said, "Have you been in it yet?" Adeline set her cup down. "The shed, yesterday." Della nodded slowly, still looking at the window. "I wondered when somebody would." "You knew what's in there." "I know what's in there." A pause. "Not the particulars, I know the shape of it." Adeline waited. She had learned at a kitchen table in another state that waiting is a weapon. "Everybody in Hollis Bend knows about that building, honey," Della said. "Every last one of us, over 60. It's not a secret. That's the part folks get wrong when they hear about it later. They think it was a secret." She finally turned her head. Her eyes were wet and completely steady. "It was never a secret. Nobody ever asked to see inside. There's a difference, and the difference is the whole thing." Adeline felt the coffee go cold in her hands. 50 years, she said. 54. "And nobody. Della set the cup down without a sound. "Including me. I want that said plain since you'll find it out anyway. Including me." She left the pie. She did not stay for a second cup. The truck came back at 2:40 in the afternoon, and this time Adeline was on the porch when it pulled in. The man who got out was maybe 50 in a good jacket with a haircut that cost money in a county where haircuts didn't. He came up the walk with his hand already out and a smile that arrived a half second before he did. "Mrs. Rourke, Wade Prentice, I'm the county attorney here, and I want to start by saying I'm sorry about your grandmother, and I heard about your husband, and I'm sorry about that too." He said it well. That was the thing Adeline noticed. He said it like a man who had said sorry to a lot of people and had gotten good at it, and she couldn't find the seam in it anywhere. She shook his hand. She invited him in. She poured him coffee because that was what you did and because she wanted to see how long he'd take to get to it. 4 minutes. He was good at that too. "I'll be direct with you because I think you'd rather I was. My family's been buying up along this ridge a good while. My daddy started it, my granddaddy before him. You've got 11 acres with road frontage and a spring on it, and that makes it the best piece left." He turned his cup a quarter turn. "I put a number in your mailbox before you got here. I want to make sure you saw it." "I saw it. It's a real number, cash. I don't need a bank, and I don't need an appraisal, and I'm not going to nickel you on inspection." He let that sit. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Rourke, I know a little about your situation. Small county. Halbert Voss and I go to the same church." Adeline's face did not move. Inside her, something went absolutely still. "That's an interesting thing to admit," she said. "I'd rather admit it than have you find it out." He smiled. "You've got debt and a boy and no address. I've got money and no use for a farmhouse. That's not me taking advantage of you. That's just 2 people whose problems happen to fit." It was, she thought, the single most reasonable thing anyone had said to her in 2 months, and every hair on her arms was standing up. "There's a clause on page 2, she said. "There is. You want the outbuildings gone before closing." "I do." "Why?" Wade Prentice set his cup down and folded his hands, and his voice went gentle in a way that was almost fatherly. "Liability mostly. That shed's not permitted. It's not on the tax card as a structure. The roof's failed on the north side. If a kid gets in there and a beam comes down, that's on whoever holds the deed." He shrugged. "And truthfully, it's an eyesore, and I don't want to pay $231,000 for a piece of ground and then spend another 8 tearing something down that I could have had torn down for free." Every word of it was plausible. Every word. "I'll think about it," Adeline said. "That's all I'd ask." He stood and put his hat on, and at the door he stopped and turned around, and it was so smooth it took her a full second to register that he'd been building toward it the whole time. One thing, however you decide, get that shed emptied and down before you list it with anybody else if it comes to that. It'll cost you money on the sale otherwise. I'd hate for you to lose $10,000 over a woodshed. That was twice. He had said it twice in 11 minutes. Adeline stood on the porch and watched the truck go and said out loud to nobody at all. He didn't ask what was in it. Not once. A stranger buys 11 acres in the one building he mentions 3 times. He never asks what's inside. She called Ezra Kane on Thursday because Halbert Voss gave her his number and said he was the only surveyor in 2 counties who'd answer a phone in November. He came out Friday morning with a rod and a tablet and boots that had been resold twice, and he was 38 and quiet, and he didn't do small talk, which Adeline appreciated more than she expected to. She told him she wanted the corners marked before she listed. That was true. It was not the whole truth, and he didn't ask for the whole truth, which she also appreciated. He walked it in 4 hours. Toby went with him for the last 2 and came back knowing what a monument was and using the word constantly. At 2 o'clock, Ezra came up on the porch and did not sit down. "Can I ask you a straight question, Mrs. Rourke?" "Adeline, yes." "Do you know what your grandmother's plat says?" "I know the tax card says 11.2 acres. "Right." He set the tablet on the rail and turned it toward her, but he didn't look at it. He looked at her. "There's iron in the ground out there, old iron, pins set by hand, and I'd guess by the corrosion they've been in 50, 60 years. Somebody surveyed this parcel properly once and paid for it and set real monuments, which nobody does for 11 acres of orchard unless there's a reason. And the pins don't match the plat." He said it flat. "The pins put the west line about 400 feet further out. The recorded plat pulls it back to the fence row." He paused. "Ma'am, the ground says this parcel is somewhere north of 15 acres. The courthouse says 11.2. Adeline stared at him. "4 acres," she said. "4 and change." "Since when?" "That's not my department, and I measure what's there." Then, because he was apparently not as neutral as he sounded, he added, "But I'll tell you that a parcel doesn't lose 4 acres by accident, and it doesn't lose them quietly. And whoever gained them didn't move a fence, because the fence is on the old line, which is why I found the pins in the first place." He picked up his tablet. "You want it in writing?" "Yes," Adeline said. "Yes, I want it in writing today." That afternoon, she went back into the chest, and she went for the 3rd journal. She'd been circling it for 4 days. 2 of the journals had names on the flyleaf. Ruth Halloway W. Halloway, and the 3rd had nothing. Only a pressed apple blossom under the leather strap, gone brown and thin as a moth's wing. She opened it, and the handwriting was different from either of them. Steadier, squared off. A man who'd been taught penmanship and hadn't let it go. The first line stopped her cold. "If anybody is reading this, then Ruth finally decided the world could stand to know who I was." She sat down where she was. The early entries were a life. A man who'd come into Cutter County in the fall of 1967 with a suitcase, a toolbox, and $110. He wrote about being turned out, not by strangers, by his own. There was a paragraph about a mother who'd stopped writing back, and a paragraph about a hometown that had gotten very good at looking through him, and he never once gave the reason, and Adeline understood after 20 pages that he wasn't withholding it. He just stopped believing the reason mattered. The result was the same either way. Then in December of 1967, W. Halloway asked me to supper. Not to work, to supper. I have thought about that distinction for 4 days, and I am ashamed of how long I sat in the truck before I went to the door. Adeline put her hand over her mouth. She knew that. Not his version, hers. 19 days behind a laundromat. The interview where the woman asked for a current address. The way you learn fast that the world has 100 polite ways of telling you that you're not from here anymore. She read for 3 hours. Toby brought her a sandwich at some point, and she ate half of it without noticing. Isaiah bought in, that was the word he used, bought in April of 1969 for $4,200, which was every cent he had, and $1,100 he borrowed from a man in Asheville. Isaiah Bell purchased an undivided 1/2 interest in the Halloway place. He wrote the number down. He wrote down the date he finished paying the Asheville man back. He wrote down what Ruth said when the deed came in the mail, and Adeline read that line 4 times. Ruth held it up and said, "Now nobody can put you off it." Wendell didn't say anything. He shook my hand for about 11 seconds. He planted 40 trees. He put in the second well. He built the shed himself in the fall of 1970, and there was a page of nothing but material costs, and at the bottom underlined, "This one is mine." Adeline flipped ahead. The entries thinned out in late 1970. The tone changed. There was a note about a man who'd come by the orchard twice asking questions about the deed. There was a note about the county not renewing something. There was a line she read 6 times without understanding it. Wendell went into town about it and came back and would not tell Ruth what they said to him. Then January 1971, and one entry that was 4 words long, they filed it anyway. She drove to the Register of Deeds Monday morning with Toby in the back seat doing multiplication tables out loud, and she paid $4.40 for 2 certified copies, and she sat in the Bronco in the courthouse lot and read them with the engine running for the heat. The first was the 1969 deed. There it was recorded, indexed real. Wendell J. Halloway and Ruth A. Halloway to Isaiah T. Bell, an undivided 1/2 interest. Consideration $4,200. The second was a quit claim recorded March 1971. Isaiah T. Bell to Harlan Prentice, all right, title and interest in and to the above described premises. Consideration $1, one R&Os and other good and valuable consideration. $1. A man who had paid $4,200 of his own money and borrowed $1,100 more and planted 40 trees and dug a well and built a building with his own hands and written, "This one is mine," underneath the lumber receipts, had signed it all away 23 months later for $1. Adeline read the signature. It looked like his. It looked exactly like the hand in the journal, and that was somehow the worst part. She looked at the witness line, "Oh, Rance." She looked at the notary block. "Sworn and subscribed before me this 4th day of March 1971, Harlan Prentice, Senior Notary Public, Cutter County." She sat with that for a while. The notary and the buyer had the same last name. Then she looked up at the courthouse and thought about a county attorney in a good jacket saying, "My granddaddy started it," and she felt the cold thing in her chest turn over. She spent that night going back through Ruth's letters for 1971, and she found the gap immediately because it was enormous. The letters to Isaiah ran October 1968 through February 1971, sometimes 3 a month. Then nothing. 14 months of nothing. And then in May of 1972, one more, and it was not tied in with the others. It was folded separately at the bottom of the chest, unsent, no envelope. No address, just a page in Ruth's hand that had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. Isaiah, I have started this 11 times. Wendell can't sleep. He gets up at 3 and goes and stands at the fence. I asked him last week if we should go to Raleigh with it, and he said, "And who do you suppose in Raleigh is going to take our word over a notary's?" And I said, "We could try," and he said, "Ruth, we tried in March. You told me not to make it worse. I have obeyed you, and I will be paying for that obedience for the rest of my life." The thing nobody understands is that they did not take it from you. Not by themselves. It took 40 people to take it from you, and 39 of them never signed a thing. They just didn't say anything. I was one of the 39, and I sat in the second row. Adeline read that paragraph, and something happened in her chest that she could not have described to a doctor. She thought about a locksmith who wouldn't meet her eyes. She thought about her own mother's voice saying she'd rather sit on 11 acres of weeds 40 times over 30 years. And she thought for the first time about the fact that her mother had never once said, "What weeds? Whose land? Why?" She got up and walked around the kitchen twice and sat back down. Because there was a problem with the dates, and she'd been circling it for an hour without letting herself look at it directly. The quit claim said Isaiah Bell signed away his half in March 1971 and left Cutter County. The tax ledger said Bell paid the property tax in 1972, in 1973, and every year after for 53 years. Why would a man who'd sold out for $1 and left the county keep paying tax on somebody else's land for 5 decades? She went out to the shed at 11:30 at night with the flashlight she hadn't needed on Tuesday. She read the third journal from the back this time. Backward entry by entry, the way you check a ledger when you already know there's a hole in it and you're looking for where it starts. The last entry was short, 3 lines. Ruth brought the boy down to see the trees. He's got Wendell's hands. I did not go up to the house. She looked at the date at the top of the page, September 14, 1973. Adeline's hand went out and braced flat on the workbench. 2.5 years after Isaiah Bell was supposed to have sold his interest, taken his dollar, and left Cutter County forever, he had been sitting somewhere on this property, writing in this journal, watching Ruth Halloway walk her grandson through the orchard. He never left. I was here. He was here the whole time, and the courthouse said he was gone, and the courthouse had said it in March of 1971 with a witness and a notary and a signature that looked precisely perfectly like his. She flipped forward through the empty pages after that entry fast, the way you do when you already know, and 40 leaves and something slid out and hit the floor. A single sheet folded once. Not Isaiah's hand. Ruth's, the late version, the hard right, leaned the hand from the envelope that said, "For my family." 6 words. The real one is not here. He was a boy when it happened. He wasn't one of the 40, his father was. Adeline read that line standing up in the shed at 11 at night, and she understood immediately that her grandmother had done something to her that was either the cruelest or the kindest act of the whole business, and that she would not know which for at least a week. Because it wasn't a clue, it was a filter. Ruth had refused to give a name and had instead handed over the one piece of information that made the name findable only by a person willing to do the work, and more to the point, findable only by a person who would arrive at that door already understanding what she was walking into. A boy in 1971, a father who signed 54 years of a man holding a piece of paper that convicted his own daddy of forgery. Adeline sat down on the floor with her back against the cedar chest and said out loud, "You did that on purpose." 12 days, that was the number now. 12 days until a county crew came with a chain and a truck and pulled this building into a pile, and every letter and journal and photograph inside it would go into her Bronco or go into a landfill. And once the shed was gone, the demolition lien would attach to the parcel, and Prentice Land Holdings would buy the whole thing at a price that reflected the lien. She went inside and made coffee at 11:40 and got out a legal pad. Names. She needed names. Every man in Cutter County who had been an adult in March of 1971 and who had had a son. Alive. She started with the burial book because Reverend Tull had let her photograph 40 pages of it, and she still had everyone on her phone. Then the church membership rolls. Then the 1970 census index at the library, which took her 9 hours across 2 days and gave her a list of 211 households. Then she started cutting. She cut every household that had left the county before 1980. She cut every household with no male child born between 1948 and 1960. She cut everybody who'd moved in after 1969 because Ruth had said neighbor and a neighbor in H4 meant somebody who'd been on that ridge already. 211 became 61, 61 became 22. She sat at the kitchen table on the 4th night with 22 names in front of her and Toby asleep down the hall, and she looked at them until the letters stopped being letters. Then she did the thing she'd been avoiding, which was to stop looking for a man and start looking for a silence. She went back through Ruth's letters, the sent ones, the ones from 68 to 71, hunting for names of neighbors. Ruth had named everybody. She named the woman who brought squash. She named the man who fixed the tractor. She named a boy who came to help pick in October of 1970 and worked 11 days and would not take money for 4 of them. Adeline found that boy on page 3 of a letter dated November 1970. The ranch boy has been up here every afternoon since his daddy passed. He doesn't say much. Isaiah's been teaching him to prune, and I believe it's the only place on this ridge that child is comfortable. Adeline stopped breathing. Rance, the witness on the forged quitclaim, was O. Rance Ollie Wilburn, Rance buried June 1970, survived by wife Effie's son Corbin. The dead man whose name was forged onto the document had a son. And the son had spent the fall of 1970 in that orchard being taught to prune apple trees by Isaiah Bell. She got up so fast the chair went over. She did not go that night. She made herself wait until morning, and she was glad because by morning she'd understood something. Ruth hadn't withheld the name to protect a secret. She'd withheld it because a woman arriving at Corbin Rance's door demanding a document was going to get the door shut, and the only person who could get inside was somebody who understood before she opened her mouth exactly what that man had been carrying. His father's name was on a forgery, not as a forger, as a witness, as a dead man made to sign, which meant Ollie Rance either did it from the grave, which was impossible, or somebody had reached into a grave 9 months old and used a man's name because a dead man cannot say, "I never was there." Corbin Rance had not been protecting his father's crime. He'd been protecting his father from being remembered as one. And the only way to prove the deed was forged was to prove his father's signature on it was fake, which meant putting the Rance name in the middle of a fraud in a county where everybody's name was all they had. Adeline sat in the Bronco outside a small brick house on Sutter Road for 6 minutes before she knocked. I was 74. He opened the door about 10 inches. Mr. Rance, my name's Adeline Rourke. I know who you are. Flat, not unkind. You spoke at the commission Tuesday. Yes, sir. Half the county's talking about it. He didn't move. And the other half's talking about you. Mr. Rance, whatever you're here for, ma'am, I'm not the man. He started to close it. And Adeline said the only thing she had which she had chosen in the car and which she was not sure of even as it left her mouth. He taught you to prune. The door stopped. In the fall of 1970, every afternoon after your father passed, my grandmother wrote it in a letter and she said you didn't talk much, and she said that Orchard was the only place on the ridge you were comfortable. Corbin Rance stood in his own doorway and did not say anything for a very long time. Then he said in a voice that had gone somewhere else entirely, he'd hold the limb and make me find the collar with my thumb before he'd let me cut. Said if you can't feel it, you don't cut it. Yes, sir. I was 14. He looked past her out at the road. 14 and my daddy'd been in the ground 4 months and I'd stopped talking to my mother. And that man let me follow him around an orchard for 6 weeks and never asked me one question about it. Adeline's eyes stung and she let them. Mr. Rance, I know what you have. He came back from wherever he'd been, his face closed. You don't know anything. I know it's a deed. I know it's the 1969 deed with Isaiah Bell's real signature on it. I know my grandfather gave it to your family in 1974 after the vault fire, and I know my grandmother asked for it back 40 times and you wouldn't hand it over. She kept her voice level, and I think I know why. You think you know why? Because the forged one has your father's name on it, Adeline said, and you've spent 50 years knowing that if you handed that paper over, the first thing anybody in this county would say is Ollie Rance witnessed a fraud. Corbin Rance's hand came off the door, and he put it flat against the frame like a man steadying himself on a boat. Get off my porch, he said. She got off his porch. She came back the next day. He didn't answer. She came back the day after. He answered and said one sentence, I've got nothing for you, and shut it. On the fourth day, she brought Toby, and afterwards she was ashamed of it and also would have done it again. And she made him wait in the truck, and Corbin Rance looked past her at the boy in the passenger's seat, and something in his jaw moved, and he still said no. 8 days. She went to 5 other doors that week, working the list of 22 in case she was wrong. The first man wouldn't come out from behind the screen. The second told her she was going to get somebody hurt and closed the door in the middle of her sentence. The third was a woman in her 90s who took Adeline's hands and cried for 4 full minutes and said, I remember him. I remember him. He was so tall. And Adeline said gently, would she be willing to say that in a room? And the woman's hands went cold in hers. And she said, honey, I have a grandson, works for the county. The fourth didn't answer. The fifth was Della Whitcomb, and Adeline went there last on purpose and stood on the step and said, you didn't stand up. Della looked at her. No, she said, I didn't. You made 11 phone calls to fill that room, and then you sat there and looked at the floor. I did. Why, hi, and Della Wickham, 83 years old, said the truest thing anybody said to Adeline in 6 weeks. Because when I was 29 years old and I knew and I said nothing, and if I stood up Tuesday night, the first question in that room wouldn't have been what did Prentice do? It would have been what did Della know? Her chin was shaking. 54 years, I've been quiet, and every year it gets more expensive to stop, and now it costs everything I've got, and I am a coward, Adeline. That's all it is. There's no better word, and I've looked for one. 6 days. She had the notarial register. She had the burial record. She had the survey. She had 53 years of tax receipts in a journal dated 2.5 years after a man supposedly left the state. What she did not have was the original deed, and Prentice's answer at Superior Court was going to be simple and probably effective. The 1971 quitclaim is presumed valid. After 54 years, the plaintiff's evidence is circumstantial, the notarial defect is curable, and the parties are all dead. She needed a paper with Isaiah Bell's actual hand on it, executed and delivered and never surrendered. She sat in the shed on the fifth night and read the third journal again. And this time she read it the way she read a ledger, not for meaning, for anomalies. And on the second pass, she found something she'd walked past 4 times. It was a single line from October 1970. Gave the boy my pruning knife. He'll do more with it than I would. Adeline put the journal down. Then she drove to Corbin Rance's house at 8 in the morning, and she did not knock. She stood at the bottom of the steps and waited until he came out, which took 19 minutes. I told you, Bree, he gave you his knife. Corbin stopped on the top step. October 1970, Adeline said. It's in his journal. Gave the boy my pruning knife. He'll do more with it than I would. She looked up at him. Do you still have it? He didn't answer, which was the answer. Mr. Rance, a man who kept a 14-year-old boy's company for 6 weeks after his daddy died, didn't do it because he needed help pruning. And you know that, and you've known it for 54 years, and I don't believe for 1 minute you've been protecting your father. Her voice cracked open. I think you've been protecting him. I think you decided a long time ago that the only way Isaiah Bell doesn't end up a footnote in a fraud case is if nobody ever opens the case. And I'm telling you, sir, that's not protection. That's the thing that's been eating this county alive since before I was born. Corbin Rance stood on his step. They'll bury my daddy twice, he said, and his voice broke on it. They already buried him once with a line on top, Adeline said. Sir, your father didn't witness that deed. He couldn't. That's the whole point. The only thing that paper says about Ollie Rance is that somebody in this county thought a dead man was safe to use. She was crying now and didn't stop. You put that deed in my hand, and I don't clear Isaiah Bell alone. I clear your daddy too. Right now the record says Ollie Rance stood in a room in March of 1971 and watched a man sign away his home. I can prove he was 9 months in the ground. Which one do you want on the stone? The wind moved in the yard. Then Corbin Rance turned around and went inside and left the door standing open. And Adeline stood there for 11 seconds, not sure whether she'd been dismissed or invited. He came back with a coffee tin. It was a chock-full of nuts can with a plastic lid, and he held it in both hands like it was hot. 52 years, he said. My mother gave it to me when she went into the home in 73 and told me to never open it and never lose it, and I have done both of those things every single day since. He put it into Adeline's hands. Inside, folded in quarters, was a single sheet of onion skin, and beneath it a pruning knife with a bone handle worn pale on one side. She unfolded the paper with Corbin Rance watching, and there it was. Deed Book 218, page 91, the original executed copy. Wendell J. Halloway and Ruth A. Halloway to Isaiah T. Bell. An undivided 1/2 interest, $4,200, signed in a squared-off hand she had spent 3 weeks reading in a leather journal. Mr. Rance, she could barely get it out. Will you say it in a room? He looked at the knife in the tin. I'll say it, he said. The hearing was set for the 9th of December in Superior Court, 3 days before the county was scheduled to take the shed, and Halbert Voss filed the emergency motion to stay the demolition on the strength of the original deed in the burial record. Wade Prentice opposed it in writing, and his brief was excellent, and Adeline read it twice at 2 in the morning and found on page 9 the thing that ended him. It was in the section arguing his family's superior claim. Petitioner and petitioner's predecessors have maintained, improved, and exercised continuous and exclusive dominion over the disputed acreage without interruption from 1971 to the present. Continuous and exclusive. Since 1971, Adeline sat back in her chair in the kitchen and put her hand over her mouth. Because the 1971 quitclaim did not say Isaiah Bell sold his interest and moved on. She'd read it 40 times. It recited in Harlan Prentice Sr.'s own drafting that the grantor had abandoned said premises and removed himself from Cutter County and had failed to pay taxes, assessments, or upkeep thereon. That was the justification. That was the whole architecture of it. Isaiah Bell abandoned the land, so the transfer was a formality, cleaning up an empty half-interest. And there were 53 consecutive years of tax receipts on that parcel paid by the Bell family, logged in Ruth Halloway's hand with the county's own stamps on the back of every one. If Isaiah Bell abandoned it and stopped paying, the Bell family did not pay the taxes for 53 years. If the Bell family paid the taxes for 53 years, Isaiah Bell did not abandon it. And if Wade Prentice's own brief claimed his family had exercised continuous and exclusive dominion since 1971, then he was claiming exclusive dominion over a parcel whose tax bill was being paid every October by somebody else. The fraud could not hold both halves of itself up at once. It never could. It had just never been made to stand in the same room as its own paperwork. Adeline wrote it out on a legal pad in 9 lines, and then she put her head down on the table and laughed until she cried. Superior Court, December 9th, and the room was fuller than the commission had been. Naomi Bell drove down from Baltimore with her daughter and sat in the second row, and Adeline noticed the row and knew exactly why and never asked. Toby sat with Ezra. Della Whitcomb sat alone at the end of an aisle with her handbag in her lap. Corbin Rance sat in the back with the coffee tin on his knees. Voss put it in order, and Adeline had built the order herself, and it went like a column of figures. The 1969 deed original, produced from a custody chain 52 years long, testified to by the man who'd held it. The 1971 quitclaim with its recitation of abandonment. The Notarial Commission Register, certified Harlan Prentice Sr., expired January 1970, not renewed until 1974. The Mount Pleasant Burial Register, certified by Reverend Toll Ollie Wilburn Rance, interred June 6, 1970, 53 years of tax receipts. And then Voss stood and read from Wade Prentice's own brief the phrase continuous and exclusive dominion and set it beside the tax record and did not editorialize and sat down. The judge asked county counsel to respond. Wade Prentice stood, and for the first time since Adeline had met him, he took a half-second too long. Your Honor, the tax payments are, there's no evidence connecting those payments to any claim of ownership. Mr. Prentice, the judge said, your own filing says exclusive. Somebody else was paying the bill. Corbin Rance was called, and he was not a good witness. His voice shook. He lost the thread twice. He had to be asked the same question 3 ways. But when Voss asked him why he kept it, he stopped shaking and looked straight at the back wall and said, because my daddy's name is on the other one, and he was dead, and dead men can't say I wasn't there. I've had 52 years to say it for him, and I didn't, and I've got to live with that, whether this court does anything or not. Then he said, that man taught me to prune. He gave me his knife. I've had it in a coffee can with the paper that could have saved him since I was 17 years old. And then Corbin Rance stood up before he was excused out of order, and the bailiff started to move, and the judge lifted one hand and said, his name was Isaiah Bell, and he lived here. The room stayed quiet for about 2 seconds. Then Della Whitcomb stood up in the aisle. She didn't say anything. She just stood. Then the clerk from the basement stood up in the back with her coat still on. Then a man in his 80s near the window got up, using the pew in front of him, and said loud, I bought apples off him every fall, 1969 to 1972. He looked around the room furious. 1972. The woman in her 90s who'd cried on her own porch stood up, and her grandson stood up beside her and helped her do it. Then Naomi Bell stood, and the room went still, and she said in a voice that carried without any effort at all, my name is Naomi Bell. Isaiah Bell was my grandfather. My mother spent her whole life believing he left us, and I have spent 61 years being ashamed of a man who paid the taxes on this land every October until the day he died. Her voice did not break. I would like the record to show that his family never got one letter from a single person in this county. Not one. You all knew where we were. You knew, and you let my mother go to her grave thinking he ran. By the time the judge called for order, 11 people were on their feet, and nobody sat down when he did. The order came down on the 19th. The 1971 quitclaim was void ab initio, no valid acknowledgement, a witness who could not have witnessed, in a recital of abandonment, contradicted by 53 years of the county's own tax stamps. The transfer had never legally happened. Title in the 1/2 undivided interest had never left Isaiah T. Bell and passed by intestate succession to his heirs. The boundary petition was dismissed. The plat was ordered corrected to the monuments Ezra Kane had found in the ground. The demolition citation was quashed, and the judge set a sentence from the bench that ran in the Cutter County paper for a week, that a county could not cite a building as a hazard on Tuesday when its own attorney had offered to buy the land on the condition it be destroyed on Monday. Wade Prentice resigned as county attorney in January. There was a state bar referral. There was talk of more. Adeline followed none of it closely, which surprised her. She was in the courthouse hallway when it was read, and Naomi Bell came out and stood beside her, and neither of them knew what to do with their hands. 15.5 acres, Naomi said. Half of it's mine. Half of it's yours. Naomi looked at her. You could have sold it in October and been gone. 231,000, Adeline said. Cash, 30 days. And you didn't. Adeline thought about the answer for a second because she wanted to get it right. My grandmother sat in the second row for 54 years, she said. Somebody in my family was going to have to stand up eventually. It got to be me. Vivian Rourke was on the farmhouse porch when Adeline got home, sitting on the step with a cardboard box on her knees, 71 years old and smaller than Adeline remembered. Adeline stopped at the bottom of the walk. I read about it in the paper, Vivian said. The Asheville paper picked it up. Yes. I've been sitting here 2 hours working out what to say, and I haven't got anything that isn't an excuse. Her hands were tight on the box. I put you and my grandson in a car, Adeline. I've known that every day since, and I told myself the trust required it, and the trust didn't require it. I chose it. Adeline stood there. She had imagined this. She'd imagined it in a laundromat parking lot at 4 in the morning, and she had a speech, and the speech had been good, and she discovered, standing in her own yard, that she didn't want it. What's in the box, she said. Photographs. Daniel Reed as a boy. Some of you two. Vivian's voice went. There's one of you dancing barefoot on your honeymoon. I don't think you've ever seen it. I've had them in my closet since September, and I couldn't look at them, and I couldn't throw them out. Adeline came up the walk and took the box and set it on the rail. You can come in, she said. I don't deserve that. No, Adeline said. You don't. And then because she had just spent 6 weeks learning exactly what it costs a place when nobody says the thing out loud. Neither did he. He got put off this land with a forged signature, and 40 people watched, and every one of them had a reason, and every reason was as good as yours. She picked up the box and held the door with her hip. I'm not telling you it's all right. It isn't, and I don't know if it will be, but I'm not going to be the 40th person on this porch who decided the easiest thing was to say nothing. Vivian Rourke put her hand over her face and cried, and Adeline let her, and did not touch her, and did not leave. Then she held the door open until the older woman got up and came inside. Vivian stayed 4 days, and neither of them called it a visit. And on the second morning, Adeline came into the kitchen and found her mother-in-law washing dishes at 6:15 with her sleeves pushed up, and something in Adeline's chest went loose that she hadn't known was tight. They didn't talk about the house in Ohio. Not once. Adeline decided that on the first night lying awake, and it turned out to be the right call. Because what they talked about instead was Reed, his 4th-grade teacher, the summer he broke his collarbone, the way he ate cereal standing up his whole life and drove both of them crazy with it. Toby sat between them and listened like a boy at a campfire, and by the 3rd day he'd stopped calling her ma'am and started calling her Gran. And Vivian left the room when he did it and came back with her eyes red and pretended she'd been looking for her glasses. On the last morning, she stood by her car and said, I'd like to come back at Easter. Come at Easter. Just like that. No, Adeline said. Not just like that, but come. She drove off, and Adeline stood in the drive and felt the strangest thing she'd felt in months, which was not forgiveness and not peace and not anything with a name. It was more like putting down a weight and discovering her arms still hurt. She'd learned to expect that now. Nothing about the last 6 weeks had arrived clean. The paperwork took until March. Adeline had assumed that the hard part was over on the 19th of December, and she was wrong, and the wrongness cost her 9 weeks and about $4,000 she didn't have. There was the estate of Isaiah T. Bell, which had never been open because Isaiah Bell had died in 1991 in a rented room in Asheville with no will, no assets anybody knew of, and as far as the state of North Carolina was concerned, no property. There was a determination of heirs. There was a court-appointed administrator. There was a title company that took 11 days to stop asking whether there might be other Bell descendants, and Naomi finally drove down herself and put a family Bible on the desk. And there was the question neither woman wanted to be the first to raise. They raised it in February at Adeline's kitchen table with the plat between them and the corrected acreage on it, 15.6. Partition, Naomi said. That's the word the lawyer used. Either one of us can force a sale. I know. He says I'd be within my rights to file it tomorrow. You would. Naomi turned her coffee cup a quarter turn, and Adeline recognized the gesture and had a strange half-second of thinking about Wade Prentice doing it in that same chair. Adeline, my grandfather, bought half of this ground with every cent he had, and my mother died in a two-room apartment in Baltimore that she never owned any part of. Her voice was steady, and it was not friendly. So I want to say the whole thing out loud once, and then I'll be done saying it. There is a version of this where I take the money. There is. You wouldn't fight me. No, Adeline said. I'd sign it Monday. I've thought about it more than you have, probably because I've been broke longer. She put her hands flat on the table. Naomi's 7.5 acres of that ridge is worth about $115,000. And I'm not going to sit here and tell a woman whose family got robbed that she ought to turn down $115,000 so I can feel good about my grandmother. Naomi's mouth twitched almost. Then what are you going to tell me? I'm going to tell you what's in that shed, and then I'm going to shut up. They went out to it together, and Adeline had not planned what she was going to do, and afterwards she thought it was the only honest thing she'd done all winter. She opened the cedar chest and she took out the ledger and put it in Naomi's hands. 53 years, she said, every October. Your grandfather until 91, then your mother until 2019, then somebody after that, and I still don't know who, and I've stopped asking because I think you don't know either. I don't. My grandmother wrote every one of them down. Adeline put her finger on the column. Not on a receipt, in a book, in her own hand with the name Bell next to it for 53 years. She looked up. She wasn't keeping records, Naomi. She was keeping a debt. She knew exactly what she owed and exactly who she owed it to. And she never in her whole life paid $1 of it, and she made sure whoever came after her would be able to read the number. Naomi Bell stood in a shed her grandfather had built with his own hands and turned pages for a long time. Then she said, "What do you want to do with it?" "I want to keep it whole. Both halves, one parcel, and both our names recorded in that basement." Adeline's throat worked. "And I want to put every letter and every photograph and every page of that journal in a room where anybody in this county can walk in and read them for free." "That's not worth $115,000. "No," Adeline said. "It's worth more than that, and it doesn't pay anything, and I know exactly what I'm asking you to give up, and I'm asking anyway." Naomi closed the ledger. "My mother had a saying," she said. "She'd say, 'Don't you take the check they offer you to be quiet.'" She set the book down on the workbench. "She said it about a settlement once, some hospital thing. I always thought it was about pride." "Was it?" "No." Naomi looked around the shed at the shelves, at the rocking chair, at the photograph of 3 people laughing under apple trees. "It was about this. I just didn't know it was about this." They filed it on the 11th of March. Holloway Bell joint tenancy, undivided, one parcel, 15.6 acres. Adeline paid the recording fee in cash, $38, and she stood in the same basement where she had found a lapsed commission in a book with a soft spine, and she watched a clerk stamp the deed, and she thought that it had taken 54 years and $38 to make the courthouse tell the truth. She was, at that point, still nearly broke. That was the part she never left out later when people asked. There was no windfall. The land was worth money on paper and produced none. The estate had eaten most of the small insurance settlement that finally came through in January. She took a bookkeeping job in Asheville 3 days a week, 40 minutes each way, and she did the other 4 days on the property. And she was tired in a way she had never been tired in her life. The farmhouse had a furnace that failed in February. The orchard hadn't been pruned properly in 6 years. She learned to prune badly from a library book. And then Corbin Rance drove up one Saturday without being asked and stood at the end of a row and watched her ruin a limb and said, "Find the collar with your thumb. If you can't feel it, you don't cut it." He came every Saturday after that. He never called first. He'd stay 4 hours and take a sandwich and refuse coffee and go home. In April, he brought the pruning knife back out of the coffee tin and put it in Toby's hand and closed the boy's fingers around it and said, "Now don't you lose it," and got in his truck and left before anybody could say anything to him about it. Della Whitcomb came in March, and she came with a shoebox, and she stood on the porch and said, "I've got letters from Ruth, 1971 to 1979. She wrote me about it for 8 years, and I never wrote back about it once. Not one line. I'd write back about the weather." She held out the box. "I'd like them in the room, and I'd like my name on them so people know who she was writing to." Adeline took the box. "You don't have to put your name on it." "Yes, I do," Della said. "That's the whole point of the room, isn't it?" The room opened on the 3rd Saturday in June, and it opened badly. Ezra had rebuilt the roof over 4 weekends, the north side where it had failed, framed properly, and permitted this time, and Adeline paid him, and he took it, which she'd insisted on. Two of the county's own building inspectors came out on a Sunday off the clock and signed off on the structure and would not take $1. And one of them said, not looking at her, "My wife's people are rances," and left it at that. They put in glass cases along the north wall, donated by a museum in Marion that was replacing theirs. The journals went in. The letters went in by year. The tax ledger got its own case in the middle, open to 1971, because Adeline decided the single most important object in that building was a column of figures. The photograph went on the wall above the cedar chest Ruth Wendell Isaiah, 3 people under apple trees, and beneath it a small card with 4 lines and no adjectives. She expected 11 people. 62 came. In an hour and a man Adeline didn't know walked up to the ledger case and stood there so long that she went over. "Sir, can I help you find something? My father was the one who called Halbert Voss." He said it without preamble, staring into the case. "March of that year. Told him your grandmother was failing and the family in Ohio wasn't coming down." He swallowed. He worked for Prentice. That's how the offer got dated the 9th. Adeline felt the floor tilt. "Your father told him she was dying." "Yes, ma'am." "So they could get an offer in her hand before she was too far gone to sign yes, ma'am?" The man's face was the color of paper. "He's 81. He's got the shakes. He asked me to come tell you because he can't drive and he wouldn't put it in a letter." He finally looked at her. "He said to tell you he took $200 for it. He said if he'd known she'd be dead in 3 days, he'd like to think he wouldn't have. He said he's not sure that's true, and he didn't want me lying to you about it." Adeline stood in her grandmother's shed with 62 people around her. "What's your father's name?" "Lyle Beto." "Would he let me write it on a card," she said, "and put it in that case?" The man closed his eyes. "He said you'd ask that," he said. "He said yes." The notebook was Toby's idea, and Adeline had almost talked him out of it. He'd wanted a book on a table where people could write down anybody the town had forgotten, and Adeline had said it was too much, too soft, that the room ought to be about evidence. And Toby, 10 years old by then, had said the thing that ended the argument. "Mom, the evidence only worked because Grandma Ruth wrote stuff down for 50 years when nobody asked her to." She put the table in that afternoon. The first entry was his. "My dad would have liked this place." Under it, in different ink and a shaking hand, somebody had added, "Ollie Rance was my daddy, and he never witnessed anything." By August, the first book was full. By November, there were 4. People brought things, discharge papers, a wedding photograph of a couple who'd been married by a justice of the peace 2 counties over in Montgomery because Mount Pleasant wouldn't do it. A woman drove up from Gaffney with her mother's employment record from a mill that had told everybody it never hired who it hired. A high school teacher started sending students with recorders, and by the second spring, there were 41 interviews with people over 75 in a binder, and 11 of those people were dead within 3 years, and every one of them was still in that binder. The Asheville paper ran it, then a Charlotte station. Then somebody in Raleigh in the state archives called and asked very carefully whether Mrs. Rourke would consider a preservation grant, and Adeline said yes, on the condition that the originals stayed in the shed. "They're not safe there," the woman from Raleigh said. "They were safe there for 54 years, ma'am," Adeline said. "The safest place in Cutter County for that paper was the one building nobody would open." Then Naomi came down 8 or 9 times a year and eventually just left clothes in the back bedroom. She was the one who found the last thing. It was the following winter, and she was working the 3rd journal for the archive index, going page by page for the transcription. And she called Adeline at 9 at night and said, "Get out here." They sat in the shed with the heater running. 40 pages past his last entry, there's your grandmother's note. The real one is not here. "I know, that's where I found it." "Turn 10 more. Adeline turned 10 more, and there in the squared-off hand was one final entry with no date at all, written in pencil faint, the letters not fully formed, the hand of a much older man. "R came to Asheville. 3rd time this year. She wants me to let her take it to a lawyer in Raleigh." I told her no again. She asked me why, and I gave her the reason I always give, which is that it would cost her everything and buy me nothing. And she said, "Isaiah, that is not a reason, that is an excuse," and I did not have an answer for her. Here is the treason, and I am putting it here because I cannot say it to her face. If she takes it up and loses, I lose the last people who knew me. If she takes it up and wins, that county has to look straight at what it did, and I do not believe it can, and I do not want to watch it fail again. So I have chosen to be a man who was robbed rather than a man who was not believed. That is a small choice and a coward's one, and I have made it 40 times. Or if you ever read this, and you read everything I release you from it, whatever you decide, you have my hand on it. Naomi Bell put both hands over her mouth. Adeline sat with the book open on her knees and could not speak for a full minute. She had permission, Naomi finally said. All those years. He released her. And she still didn't. No, Adeline looked at the page. Neither did he. That was the part that broke her open, sitting there. Not that her grandmother had been a coward, which she'd known since November, but that Isaiah Bell had been one too in the smallest and most human way, and that the two of them had spent 30 years handing the fear back and forth across a county line, each one protecting the other from a fight neither believed could be won. Nobody in the whole story had been a villain except a man with a stamp and 39 people who said nothing. And 2 of the 39 had loved each other. We're putting it in the case, Naomi said. All of it. All of it. The coward part too. She wiped her face hard, especially the coward part. Adeline, if we put a saint in that case, nobody who walks in here is going to see themselves in it. Put a scared man in there, and every single person in this county is going to recognize him. Bah. The romance, such as it was, took 2 years, and Adeline was the one who finally said it. She thought about that afterward and was fiercely glad of it. Ezra Kane had come out for a survey in November of the first year and had lost 2 contracts inside a week for the trouble and had never once asked her for anything. Not for thanks, not for a place, not for an answer. He fixed the roof. He came to the opening. He taught Toby to run a level and to swing a hammer without wrecking his wrist, and he went home every night to his own house 11 miles away. She waited until the deed was recorded. She waited until she had a job and a furnace that worked, and until the day she got a bank statement with a number on it that meant she could get in the Bronco with her son and go anywhere on earth and not be running from anything. Then she waited 2 more months because she wanted to be certain she wasn't reaching for a rope. She set it at the fence line in October at the end of a day of picking with her hands sticky and her back ruined. Ezra. I've been standing here about 20 minutes working out how to do this without sounding like a woman who needs something. He stopped what he was doing. I don't need anything, Adeline said. I want that understood before I say the rest of it. I've got the land, I've got the boy, I've got a job, and I could run this place by myself till I'm 80, and I know it now, which I did not know 2 years ago. Her voice went, I'm not asking because I'm short. I'm asking because I'd rather do it with you than without you, and that's the only reason, and it took me 2 years to be able to say it that way and mean it. Ezra Kane looked at the ground for a second. Took you long enough, he said. Is that a yes, Adeline? He said, I lost 2 county contracts in 1 week for a woman I'd known 9 days. I'd say we established the yes a while back. Toby turned 14. The spring the 4th room went up an addition off the back of the shed because the letters had outgrown the walls. He gave the tour on Saturdays. He was better at it than Adeline was, and he had one line he used that made grown men have to go stand outside for a minute. He'd stop at the ledger case open to 1971 and say, this is the most important thing in the building. It's not a letter. It's a bookkeeping ledger, and my great-grandmother kept it for 53 years, and she never showed it to anybody. She wrote down every single thing she knew was wrong, and she never said one word out loud. He'd let that sit. That's why you have to say it out loud. Writing it down isn't enough. She proved that. Corbin Rance died in his sleep in the 4th year, 78 years old, and his daughter called Adeline before she called the funeral home. There were 200 people at the church. Adeline spoke because he'd asked her to 2 years before in the middle of pruning a row and had never mentioned it again. She said one thing and it was short, and it was the only thing she'd prepared. Corbin Rance kept a piece of paper in a coffee can for 52 years, and everybody in this room knows the shame of that. She looked out at them, and then he stood up in a courtroom in front of every person he had ever known and said his father's name and Isaiah Bell's name in the same breath, and he did it first, and he did it when nobody else would. Her voice held. Anybody can be the second person to stand up. Della was second. I've been second most of my life. The first one pays for all of us. Corbin paid. Della Whitcomb died the following winter, 88, and she left the room her house. On the 10th anniversary, they read the names. It had started as an accident the first year someone had asked Adeline to read a few entries from the notebook aloud, and it had taken 9 minutes, and by the 10th year it took 4 hours, and they did it on the courthouse steps because the shed couldn't hold the people. Naomi read first. Adeline read last. And when she got to the end of the list, she put the pages down and said the thing she'd been building toward for a decade in front of 300 people in Cutter County, and it went in the paper and it went on the internet and it ended up carved on a piece of granite by the shed door because somebody paid for it without asking her. Isaiah Bell did not lose this land to Harlan Prentice, she said. One man with a stamp that cannot take 15 acres from anybody. It took a notary who forged a dead man's name, and it took 39 people who knew and drank coffee with him anyway. And it took 2 of them who loved him and still chose to be quiet. And it took a whole county agreeing for 54 years that the past was too heavy to lift. That's what it takes. It always takes that many. She looked at the crowd. And it took one woman with a ledger and one man with a coffee can and one boy who said, "Say it out loud," to put it back. That's what that takes too. It's never a crowd that goes first. It's one and then the room fills. Adeline Rourke came to Cutter County with 2 suitcases, a 9-year-old boy, and a plan to sell 11 acres of orchard for whatever it would bring. She had $192,000 of assessed value in her hand and a cash offer for $231, and she had debts that kept her awake and a son who had slept 19 nights in the back of a Bronco, and every reasonable person she knew would have told her to sign the paper and drive home. She didn't sign it. She opened a shed instead. And what she found in it was not treasure and not a fortune, and not even in the end a secret, because the whole county already knew. That was the shocking thing. There was never a secret. There was only a truth that everyone had agreed to carry quietly generation to generation because saying it would cost somebody something. Her grandmother left her 11 acres of land. What she actually left her was a bill 54 years overdue, an account book that named every payment on it, in the terrible knowledge that the only currency it could be paid in was one voice in one room on one night going first. Adeline Rourke paid it. Silence is not neutral. It is a choice, and it is the cheapest one available, and it is the reason every stolen thing in this world stays stolen. The land can be taken with a forged signature. The truth can only be taken by consent, and the moment one person refuses to give that consent out loud, in a room full of people who already know it comes back. It came back in Hollis Bend. Say it out loud.